There are cases that break the law. And then there are cases that break the soul. Late one evening, after days of unexplained sickness, shaking chills, and a rising temperature she couldn't control, a mother rushed her disabled daughter, born with cerebral palsy, to the hospital. She expected a simple diagnosis, maybe an infection, maybe dehydration. She never expected the doctor to pull her aside, lower his voice, and say the sentence that collapsed her world. "Your daughter is pregnant." Her mind froze. Impossible. Unthinkable. Her child couldn't even walk on her own, couldn't defend herself, could barely communicate. On the drive home, her hands trembled on the steering wheel. Nothing made sense. No one had access, no visitors, no unsupervised outings. Back inside the house, still shaking, she heard her husband's computer ping. A notification, a sound she normally ignored. But tonight it felt like a clue. She opened the device. What she saw shattered the last piece of faith she had in humanity. Welcome to True Crime Story HQ. Thanks to all my viewers and subscribers for their support. Stay tuned for daily true crime updates. Don't forget to subscribe. Denise Marie Holloway came into this world in 1974 in a small East Cleveland, Ohio apartment. She was the second of 4 children born to parents who worked themselves to the bone just to keep the lights on and food on the table. Her father spent his days doing maintenance at a Ford plant, coming home each night smelling of grease and exhaustion. Her mother cleaned houses for wealthy families in the suburbs, families whose children had bedrooms bigger than Denise's entire apartment. From a young age, Denise understood one fundamental truth about life. If you wanted something, you had to fight for it. And nothing worth having ever came easy. By the time she turned 16, Denise was already working part-time bagging groceries and stocking shelves at a local grocery store to help her family make ends meet. She watched her parents sacrifice everything, and she promised herself that her life would be different. At 18, she became the first person in her immediate family to graduate high school, a milestone that filled her mother with tears of pride. With dreams of becoming a medical assistant, Denise enrolled in community college, chasing the stability and benefits that had always eluded her family. She wanted a life where she didn't have to count pennies at the end of every month, where she could breathe without the constant weight of financial worry pressing down on her chest. At 22, Denise married her high school sweetheart, Devin Bradley. He was charming and ambitious, always talking about opening his own mechanic shop someday. For 2 years, they built what Denise believed was a good life together. When she discovered she was pregnant in 1998, Devin painted the nursery himself, picked out names, and told everyone at his job that he was going to be a father. But when baby Grace arrived in February 1999, everything changed. The doctors delivered news that would reshape Denise's entire existence. Her daughter had cerebral palsy. Grace would never walk normally, might never speak clearly, and would require lifelong care. Devin's excitement slowly faded into distance, then absence, then abandonment. By the time Grace was 2 years old, he left a note on the kitchen table and walked out of their lives forever, saying he didn't sign up for this. From 2001 onward, Denise raised Grace completely alone. She worked double shifts, learned every therapy technique, fought insurance companies, and battled school districts for accommodations. She slept 4 hours a night and considered it a luxury. Grace, despite her limitations, was a bright child with sharp eyes who loved music and laughed at cartoons. Denise built her entire world around that little girl. Every decision filtered through one question: what does Grace need? She had no idea that years later her devotion would be tested in ways she could never have imagined, and that the help she desperately needed would come wrapped in the disguise of a predator. Now, before we continue with this story, if you're finding yourself drawn into Denise's world and want to see where this journey takes her, take a moment to hit that like button, subscribe to this channel, and share this video with someone who needs to hear this story. Your support helps us bring more stories like this to light. By 2010, Denise had relocated to suburban Columbus for a better job opportunity, and she was running on fumes. 11 years of single motherhood had taken its toll, and the weariness was written in every line on her face. It was at a community potluck organized by her church that spring when she first noticed Harold Carter. He was 39 years old, 3 years her senior, divorced with no children of his own. He worked as an IT technician for a regional insurance company, the kind of quiet, unassuming man who fixed computers and kept systems running. There was nothing remarkable about him. Nothing that would make you look twice on the street. And perhaps that was exactly what made him seem so safe. Harold Eugene Carter had grown up in rural Pennsylvania, the only child of a distant father and a mother who passed away when he was just 12 years old. He bounced between relatives throughout his teenage years before enlisting in the Army after high school. He served 4 years, never saw combat, and was honorably discharged in 1991. His first marriage had lasted 7 years, ending in divorce. According to Harold, it fell apart because his wife wanted children, and he wasn't ready. What he didn't mention, what Denise wouldn't discover until much later, was that his ex-wife had filed a restraining order against him in 2003, then mysteriously withdrew it. The details were sealed, buried in court records that nobody thought to check. Harold pursued Denise with a patience that felt refreshing after years of loneliness. He didn't rush or overwhelm her with grand romantic gestures. Instead, he simply showed up. He helped carry groceries without being asked. He fixed the squeaky hinge on her front door. Most importantly, he sat with Grace during Sunday dinners and never once showed discomfort at her disability. Most men run, Denise confided to her sister Janet during a late-night phone call. They see Grace and suddenly remember they have somewhere else to be. Harold doesn't run. He just stays. For a woman who had spent a decade doing everything alone, Harold's steady presence felt like an answered prayer. But there were signs, small ones that seemed insignificant at the time. Harold was intensely private about his computer, always keeping his laptop locked in his home office behind a closed door. Work stuff, he explained with a shrug. Client data. I could lose my job if anything got leaked. He also had a peculiar habit of positioning himself near Grace during family gatherings, watching her with an attention that others might have described as caring or devoted. Denise saw a man who genuinely cared about her daughter. She had no way of knowing she was looking at something else entirely, something that would eventually destroy everything she held dear. Denise and Harold married in June 2012 in a small ceremony at her church with Janet serving as maid of honor. A handful of cousins and friends filled the modest pews, and Grace sat in the front row in a wheelchair decorated with white ribbons, beaming at her mother with pure joy. Harold suggested they honeymoon in Florida, but Denise couldn't bear to leave Grace for more than a day or two. Harold said he understood completely. That family always came first. At the time, those words sounded like devotion. Looking back, they were part of a carefully constructed performance. The first 2 years of marriage appeared stable by every outward measure. Harold took over the household finances, setting up direct deposits and creating budgets that gave Denise more financial breathing room than she had ever experienced. For the first time in her adult life, she wasn't living paycheck to paycheck, constantly calculating whether she could afford gas and groceries in the same week. Harold also took on responsibilities with Grace, driving her to physical therapy appointments when Denise's work schedule conflicted, learning how to assist with her leg braces, carrying her up the stairs on days when she was too fatigued to use her walker. Neighbors saw a patient stepfather. Church members saw a devoted husband. And Denise saw the partner she had prayed for during all those lonely years. The changes began so gradually that Denise couldn't pinpoint exactly when things shifted. In 2014, Harold suggested she cut back on her night cleaning job. "You're worn down," he said with what seemed like genuine concern. "Grace needs you present, not burned out." It sounded reasonable, even caring. But being home more meant Denise noticed things she might have otherwise missed. Harold had started volunteering to give Grace her evening baths. "You've been on your feet all day," he insisted. "Let me handle it." He began insisting that Grace's bedroom door stay open at night, supposedly for safety. He installed new software on his computer that he claimed was for work security. And then there were the small comments Grace made, fragments of sentences that were difficult to understand, words that didn't quite connect. "Daddy don't like," she would say, her face twisted with effort. Denise assumed she was talking about vegetables or bedtime, or some minor frustration her daughter couldn't articulate. She would comfort Grace, promise to fix whatever was wrong, and move on with the endless tasks of her day. She never paused long enough to consider that her daughter might be trying to tell her something far more important. The signs were there, scattered like breadcrumbs, leading to a truth too horrible to contemplate. But Denise was too drained, too trusting, and too close to see the path they formed. By the way, I'm curious. Where in the world are you watching this story unfold? Drop your location in the comments below. And if you've made it this far into Denise's story, let me know you're still here by commenting. I am still here. Let's see who's truly invested in finding out what happens next. There is something crucial that must be understood about Grace Holloway, something that would later become central to both the investigation and the trial that followed. Grace was not intellectually disabled. Cerebral palsy affects motor function, not cognition. Her brain worked perfectly well, processing the world around her with complete clarity. It was her body that had become a prison. Her vocal cords produced sounds, but the muscles required to shape those sounds into clear speech often failed her. She understood everything happening around her. She felt everything done to her. She simply couldn't always communicate it in ways others could comprehend. By 19, Grace had developed coping mechanisms to navigate her silent world. She used a communication tablet, a simple device that allowed her to press buttons with pre-recorded phrases like, "Yes," "No," "I'm hungry," and "I need help." She also had a small vocabulary of words she could say clearly: mom, water, hurt, and stop. These 4 words would later take on devastating significance. What the prosecution eventually revealed through interviews with therapists and medical professionals was that Grace had tried to tell someone what was happening to her multiple times. In 2015, during a physical therapy session, Grace became violently agitated when her male therapist touched her leg to adjust her positioning. She pulled away sharply and said, "No touch, no touch." The therapist noted it in his file as a behavioral episode related to sensory sensitivity. He never considered any other explanation. In 2016, Grace's home health aide reported that Grace seemed withdrawn and unresponsive on certain days, particularly after weekends when she had been home alone with Harold while Denise worked Saturday shifts. The aide mentioned her concerns to Denise, who brought it up with Harold. He suggested that Grace was simply going through phases, and his calm explanation seemed reasonable enough to quiet any concerns. By early 2017, Grace began having nightmares, waking up screaming with sounds that barely formed into words but carried unmistakable terror. Denise held her daughter, comforted her, and assumed it was anxiety or fear of the dark. When Grace managed to say, "Daddy night no," Denise interpreted it as her daughter asking for Harold to come say good night. She had it exactly backwards. Harold had weaponized Grace's disability against her. He told her that if she tried to tell anyone, her mother would be sent away. He said she would be put in a facility where nobody would visit her. He reminded her that no one would believe her anyway because she couldn't talk right. For 3 years, Grace lived in a house where her abuser was also her caretaker. She couldn't run. She couldn't fight. She couldn't speak clearly enough to be understood. And even when she tried, the people meant to protect her failed to listen. Harold had calculated every detail with chilling precision. The winter of 2017 arrived early in Ohio, bringing with it frost-covered windows and an unsettling sense that something in the Holloway household had changed. In late November, Grace began gaining weight in ways that seemed unusual. At first, Denise attributed it to the holidays. Grace had always loved sweet potato pie, and the buttery rolls Denise baked from her mother's recipe. A few extra pounds during the holiday season seemed perfectly normal, nothing worth worrying about. But by January, the weight was concentrated almost entirely in Grace's midsection, creating a small firm swell that Denise noticed while helping her daughter dress one morning. "She's bloated," Denise mentioned to Harold over dinner. "Maybe it's something she's eating. We should probably adjust her diet." Harold agreed without hesitation, suggesting more vegetables and less starch. Denise bought new pants for Grace, ones with elastic waistbands and looser fits that would accommodate her changing shape. She never once considered pregnancy as an explanation. The thought would have seemed absurd. Grace had never been on a date in her life. She didn't have friends who visited unsupervised. She left the house only for medical appointments, therapy sessions, and occasional church services, always accompanied by either Denise or Harold. The possibility that her daughter could be pregnant simply didn't exist in Denise's mind. More troubling than the physical changes were the behavioral shifts that accompanied them. Grace had always been affectionate with her mother, reaching for hugs and smiling brightly whenever Denise entered a room. But in early 2018, that warmth began to fade. When Denise tried to help with her morning routine, Grace flinched at her touch. When Denise brushed her hair, Grace cried without explanation. When Denise asked what was wrong, Grace would simply shake her head and stare at the floor, her eyes holding something that looked like defeat. Meanwhile, Harold's behavior shifted as well. Though Denise failed to connect the dots, he began working from home more often, claiming the commute was tiring. He suggested that Grace's health aid wasn't necessary anymore since they were managing fine. By February, the aid's visits had been reduced to just once a week. One afternoon in early February, something happened that Denise would replay in her mind thousands of times in the months to come. She was helping Grace change into pajamas when Grace suddenly grabbed her mother's hand and pressed it firmly against her stomach. Denise felt the small, hard swell beneath her palm, and Grace looked at her with an expression that was part pleading, part exhaustion, and part surrender. "Grace, does your stomach hurt?" Denise asked gently. Grace didn't answer, just kept staring with those desperate eyes. "I'll make you some tea," Denise said, pulling her hand away. "Maybe you're constipated." She walked out of the room, completely missing what her daughter had been trying to show her. If you're feeling the weight of this story the way I am, if Grace's silent struggle is resonating with you, then please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to this channel, and share it with your loved ones. Stories like this one could help protect someone you care about from the same tragic fate. Your share might just save a life. On the morning of February 20th, 2018, Grace woke up vomiting. The retching sounds pulled Denise from her sleep before dawn, and she rushed to her daughter's room to find Grace pale, sweating, and unable to keep anything down. By noon, her temperature had climbed to 101 degrees. By evening, it had reached 103, and Grace's body had begun shaking with chills that no amount of blankets could stop. Denise tried everything she knew: administering Tylenol, applying cool compresses to Grace's forehead, pushing fluids that her daughter immediately rejected. Nothing worked, and the fever continued its relentless climb. Harold suggested they wait until morning. "It's probably just a bug going around," he said with casual dismissiveness. "Everyone at my office has been sick lately. She'll probably feel better by tomorrow." But at 9 o'clock that night, when Grace began convulsing in a way Denise had never witnessed before, the decision was made. "I'm taking her to the hospital," Denise announced, already reaching for her car keys. "Something is seriously wrong." Harold offered to drive, but Denise refused. She wanted to be in the back seat with Grace, holding her daughter's hand during the drive. "I'll wait here," Harold said as they headed toward the door. "Call me when you know something." At St. Michael's Regional Medical Center, the triage team took Grace back immediately. A high fever in a patient with cerebral palsy was a red flag that demanded urgent attention, signaling potential infection or other serious complications. The medical staff ran blood tests and urine samples, checking for urinary tract infection, kidney infection, and sepsis. And then, following standard protocol for any female patient of childbearing age presenting with abdominal symptoms, they ran a pregnancy test. "Dear." Patricia Brennan reviewed the results herself in stunned silence before stepping into the hallway to find Denise. "Mrs. Holloway, I need to ask you some questions about your daughter's personal life," the doctor said quietly, her voice carefully controlled. Denise looked at her with confusion. "What do you mean personal life? She's disabled. She can barely." Dr. Brennan cut her off gently but firmly. "Mrs. Holloway, your daughter is pregnant. Approximately 14 weeks. The words landed like physical blows. Denise's vision narrowed as the fluorescent light seemed to flicker and dim around her. Pregnant. Her daughter, her sweet and helpless Grace, was pregnant. And Denise knew with immediate visceral certainty that this was not consensual because Grace could not consent. Grace could barely communicate. The doctor explained the timeline, the gestational age pointing back to early November, and stressed that someone Grace trusted had been abusing her. Fear transformed into cold, creeping suspicion. Denise's mind began racing through the impossibly short list of people with access to her daughter, and one name kept surfacing no matter how hard she tried to push it away. Standing in the harsh fluorescent light of the hospital corridor, Denise pulled out her phone with trembling hands. Confused and desperate for clarity, she needed to hear Harold's voice, needed to gauge his reaction to the impossible news she had just received. Her mind raced through every person who had ever been alone with Grace, but the list was impossibly short. Grace rarely left the house. Visitors were infrequent. The only people with consistent unsupervised access to her daughter were the home health aide, a woman Denise had known and trusted for years, and Harold, her husband. She dialed his number, her heart pounding against her ribs. He answered on the second ring, his voice calm and measured. "Denise, is everything okay? How's Grace?" There was nothing unusual in his tone, nothing that should have alarmed her, and yet something felt wrong. "Harold, the doctors found something," she said slowly, choosing her words carefully. "What do you mean? Is it serious?" Denise closed her eyes and forced the words out. "Grace is pregnant." Silence filled the line. 3 seconds. 4. 5. And then Harold spoke, and something in his voice had shifted in a way that made Denise's skin prickle with unease. "That's not possible," he said flatly. "Someone else must be involved. Someone else must be involved." Not shock, not disbelief. Not, "How could this happen?" Just immediate practice deflection. Denise's grip tightened on the phone as alarm bells began ringing in her mind. "The doctor says they have to report it to the police," she continued, keeping her voice steady. "They're required by law." And that's when she heard it clearly. The change in his breathing. Harold began to shake, the tremor audible in his voice, the breath of a man suddenly confronted with his worst fear. "The police," he repeated, his words coming faster now. "Denise, let's not overreact. We should talk about this first. Figure out what really happened before we involve anyone else." "Someone raped our daughter, Harold." The words came out harder than she intended. I know, he replied quickly. Too quickly. "But we need to think about this carefully, about Grace's privacy, about what this could do to her if it becomes public." He was saying too much, filling the silence with words that sounded like reason but felt like smoke. Denise's suspicion began to crystallize into something more solid. "I'm coming home," she said. "The doctors want to keep her overnight for observation." "Of course," Harold responded. "I'll be here. We'll figure this out together." Together. The word echoed in Denise's mind as she ended the call. For the first time in 6 years of marriage, that word sounded less like comfort and more like a threat. Something was very wrong with Harold's reaction, and Denise intended to find out exactly what he was hiding. I want to take a moment to thank you for your incredible support. This channel exists because of viewers like you who believe these stories deserve to be told. If you want to take your support to the next level, consider joining our YouTube membership today. You'll unlock exclusive perks, enjoy premium content before anyone else, and help us continue creating the stories you love. The link is in the description below. The drive home from the hospital felt endless. Every streetlight passing like a heartbeat counting down to something Denise couldn't yet name. She had left Grace under the care of the nursing staff who had convinced her that one night of observation was medically necessary given the fever and the pregnancy. Now she drove alone through the dark Ohio streets, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles had turned white. Harold's reaction on the phone kept replaying in her mind. Not what he said but how he said it. The deflection, the the fear when she mentioned police, the desperate rush to control what happened next. The house looked exactly as it always had when she pulled into the driveway. Porch light glowing warmly, Harold's car parked in its usual spot, the blue flicker of the television visible through the living room window. Everything appeared perfectly normal. And yet, nothing was normal anymore. Denise sat in her car for 5 full minutes, watching the house like it belonged to a stranger, trying to organize the chaos screaming through her mind. Something was wrong with Harold. Something was deeply fundamentally wrong, and she needed to see it for herself. When Denise walked through the front door, Harold was sitting on the couch with his laptop open on his lap. He looked up quickly, too quickly, and immediately closed the laptop screen. "Hey," he said, attempting a casual tone that didn't quite land. "I've been waiting for you. Are you okay? How's Grace?" Denise studied his face with new eyes. The concerned expression was there, perfectly arranged. The right words came easily enough, but his hands told a different story. They were gripping the laptop like it was a life raft, knuckles white with tension. "She's stable," Denise said slowly, watching him. "They're keeping her overnight." Harold set the laptop aside, but not on the coffee table. He placed it on the cushion beside him, within easy reach. For the next 20 minutes, Harold talked without pause, theorizing about who might have hurt Grace. The physical therapist, he suggested, was alone with her sometimes. The home health aide had keys to the house. Perhaps a neighbor, a delivery person, someone Grace had encountered during one of her rare outings. Anyone, everyone except himself. Denise listened and watched, noticing how his leg bounced nervously when she mentioned police interviews, how his eyes darted to the laptop when she said detectives might examine the house. Then Harold stood abruptly. "I need to use the bathroom," he announced, reaching for the laptop. He tried to take his laptop with him to the bathroom. At that exact moment, the computer pinged with a notification. Harold grabbed it quickly, too quickly, holding it against his chest like a shield. "Just work stuff," he said, his voice strained. "Updates from the server." But his carefully constructed composure had cracked. His face showed unmistakable panic. Denise's suspicion exploded into certainty. She waited until he left the room. Then she sat down in front of the laptop. The laptop screen glowed in the darkness of the living room, casting pale blue light across Denise's face as she sat down in front of it. Harold hadn't engaged the password lock in his rush to the bathroom. A small oversight that would change everything. The notification that had triggered his panic was still visible in the corner of the screen. A small pop-up that read, "Backup complete. 47 new files added to archive." Denise's finger hovered over the touchpad for a moment, her heart hammering so loudly she could hear it in her ears. Then she clicked. The notification opened a folder buried deep within the system files, hidden behind innocuous labels that would never draw attention. Inside were video files, dozens of them, each one labeled with a date, organized chronologically with meticulous precision. The earliest date was November 2015, over 2 years ago. The most recent was February 14, 2018, Valentine's Day, just 6 days before this nightmare began. Denise's hands trembled as she opened the most recent file. The video began to play, and within the first 3 seconds, she recognized the setting. Grace's bedroom, the pink walls Denise had painted herself, the stuffed animals on the shelf, the hospital bed they had installed when Grace outgrew her childhood furniture, and then she saw him. Harold moving toward the bed, his hands reaching for Grace's blanket. Denise watched for 7 seconds. 7 seconds was all she could endure before the reality of what she was seeing crashed through every defense she had ever built. This was her daughter. This was her husband. This was her home. And for more than 2 years, while Denise worked double shifts and collapsed into bed depleted each night, Harold had been violating the most precious person in her world. The pregnancy came from inside the house. The abuser had been sleeping beside her all along. Denise closed the laptop. She stood up, but her legs felt disconnected from her body, like they belonged to someone else entirely. The walls of the room seemed to bend and distort around her as she stumbled toward the kitchen. What she saw destroyed the last piece of faith she had in humanity. Everything Grace had tried to tell her, every sign she had missed, every moment she had been too busy or too depleted to truly listen, it all came crashing down on her at once. She gripped the kitchen counter to stay upright and opened her mouth to breathe. What came out instead was a scream. Not a scream of anger or fear, but something more primal. The scream of a woman whose entire reality had just been incinerated. From down the hall, she heard the bathroom door open. Harold's footsteps approached. "Denise, what's wrong? What happened?" The mother broke. She collapsed against the counter. And then she remembered the gun. Harold appeared in the kitchen doorway, his face arranged in an expression of concern that now looked grotesque to Denise. She stood with her back against the counter, the laptop clutched to her chest, her entire body shaking with the rage she had never known existed inside her. "Denise, listen to me," Harold began, his voice taking on the calm, reasonable tone she had once found comforting. "Whatever you think you saw, you're misunderstanding." He denied everything. He stood there in her kitchen, the kitchen where they had shared meals and talked about their days, and he denied the evidence of her own eyes. Misunderstanding. The word tasted like poison in her mouth. "Grace has been acting strangely lately," Harold continued smoothly. "You know that. She's been confused, agitated. Sometimes she does things, moves in ways that look inappropriate. I've been documenting it for her doctors to help them understand her behavior." The lie was so enormous, so audacious in its absurdity that for a moment Denise could only stare at him. He was telling her that the videos documenting years of abuse were medical records. He was standing in front of her, looking her in the eye, and lying with the ease of someone who had been doing it for a very long time. "There are dates on those files, Harold," Denise said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Years of dates. November 2015. You've been doing this for over 2 years. Something flickered across Harold's face, a crack in the careful act he wore. And then he made his final fatal mistake. "You don't understand," he said, his voice dropping to something colder. "Grace isn't like other girls. She doesn't experience things the same way. She doesn't remember." "She doesn't," he blamed the daughter. He stood there and blamed the 19-year-old disabled girl he had been raping for years. He called her confused. He said she was damaged. And then he pointed the finger at Denise herself, saying she had been too stretched thin and too absent to notice what was happening right in front of her. Suddenly Harold moved. He pushed past Denise, heading for the living room. He tried to grab the laptop, the evidence of everything he had done. "Give me that," he demanded, his voice sharp and commanding. "You don't understand what you're looking at." But Denise was faster. She grabbed the laptop first, clutching it against her body like a shield. Harold's eyes changed in that moment, the gentle stepfather and devoted husband vanishing completely. In his place stood something cold and calculating, something that had been hiding in plain sight for years. What happened next would be debated in courtrooms for months. Denise didn't remember making the decision. One moment she was holding the laptop. The next moment she was reaching into the kitchen drawer. Her fingers closed around the gun. The gun felt impossibly heavy in Denise's hand, a weight that seemed to pull her toward a decision she couldn't take back. Harold saw the weapon and his face went white, all the color draining away in an instant. "Denise, wait," he said, his hands rising slowly in front of him. "Let's talk about this. You don't want to do something you'll regret." But regret was already consuming her. Regret for every sign she had missed, every cry for help she had failed to hear. Every night she had slept peacefully beside a criminal while her daughter suffered in silence just down the hall. In the chaos of that moment, with Harold moving toward her and demanding the laptop, with her mind fractured by the horror of what she had discovered, Denise fired. The sound was deafening in the small kitchen, a thunderclap that seemed to shake the very walls. Harold fell backward, his body hitting the refrigerator before sliding to the floor. Blood began spreading across his shirt from a wound in his shoulder. He was alive, gasping and clutching at the injury, staring up at her with shock and disbelief written across his face. "You shot me," he said, his voice thick with pain. You actually shot me. Denise stood over him, the gun still raised, her hands trembling violently. A mother pushed beyond the limits of human sanity. A man exposed as a perpetrator. A family collapsing in the span of minutes. She could have pulled the trigger again. Part of her wanted to empty every bullet into the man who had destroyed her daughter's innocence. But something stopped her. Grace. Grace was at the hospital alone and frightened, carrying a child conceived through years of abuse. If Denise killed Harold now, she would go to prison forever. Who would take care of Grace then? Who would protect her daughter from a world that had already failed her so completely? Denise lowered the gun slowly, her arm feeling like it weighed 1,000 pounds. Harold lay bleeding on her kitchen floor, making sounds that meant nothing to her anymore. She walked to the phone and dialed 911. Her voice eerily calm when the dispatcher answered. I need an ambulance and the police, she said. I shot my husband. He's alive. He's been raping my daughter. The dispatcher asked her to repeat herself. She did, word for word with the same flat tone. But as she waited for the sirens to arrive, as Harold's blood pooled on the linoleum she had mopped just yesterday, Denise made another decision. One bullet had not been enough. Harold was alive. He would survive. He would hire lawyers and make excuses and try to blame Grace for everything. The gun had failed to deliver justice. She would need to find another way. The hours following the shooting passed in a blur of flashing lights and questions. Police officers took Denise's statement while paramedics stabilized Harold and transported him to the hospital. The laptop was seized as evidence, its contents soon to be examined by digital forensic specialists who would uncover the full scope of Harold's crimes. Denise was questioned for hours, but not immediately arrested. The evidence on the laptop had already begun to confirm her story, and detectives were now focused on building a case against Harold, rather than prosecuting a traumatized mother who had acted in the desperate aftermath of uncovering her daughter's abuse. By late afternoon, Denise had been allowed to return home, to the house where her daughter had been violated. She walked through the rooms like a ghost, seeing everything differently now. Grace's bedroom door that Harold had insisted stay open, the bathroom where he had given her baths, the couch where he sat with his laptop, organizing his collection of horrors. The rage that had temporarily subsided after the shooting began to build again, hotter and more focused than before. Harold was alive. He was being treated at the hospital for a shoulder wound that doctors said would heal completely within weeks. He would survive to face trial, where his lawyers would attempt to twist the truth, question Grace's reliability, and paint Denise as an unstable woman who had attacked her innocent husband. In the front closet, Denise found Harold's overnight bag, the one he always took when traveling for work. Inside, along with his toiletries and a change of clothes, was a bottle of Ambien, his prescription sleeping pills. 30 pills remaining. As she held the bottle in her hand, a new plan began taking shape in her mind. The shooting had been an act of impulse, a moment of temporary insanity triggered by the overwhelming horror of what she had learned. But what she contemplated now was something different. This was calculated, deliberate. A mother's cold determination to ensure that the man who had hurt her daughter would never forget what he had done. She knew Harold would come back. Despite everything that had happened, despite the evidence mounting against him, he would return to retrieve his things, to try one more time to talk his way out of consequences. Men like Harold always believed they could manipulate any situation. And when he walked through that door, Denise would be waiting. The police would handle the legal case. They would gather evidence and file charges and let the system work its slow, uncertain course. But Denise couldn't wait for the system. She couldn't trust that justice would be served. She had trusted before, trusted Harold with her daughter's life, and look where that had gotten them. This time she would take matters into her own hands. This time Harold would pay in flesh and blood. Against all logic, Harold Carter returned home the following evening. His shoulder was bandaged and his arm hung in a sling, but his arrogance remained fully intact. The police had questioned him but had not yet made an arrest as they continued processing the digital evidence. Harold seemed to believe, or had convinced himself to believe, That he could still talk his way out of this nightmare. He could still manipulate Denise the way he had manipulated her for years. He could still make his version of events become the accepted truth. His overconfidence would prove to be a fatal miscalculation. When Harold walked through the front door, Denise was waiting in the kitchen with a glass of orange juice on the counter. She had prepared for this moment, rehearsing her composure until she could appear calm and almost welcoming. "I made you some juice," she said, her voice carefully controlled. "You must be in pain." Harold studied her face, searching for the rage that had consumed her the night before. He didn't find it. What he found instead was something that should have terrified him if he had been smart enough to recognize it. The perfect stillness of a woman who had made peace with what she was about to do. Harold picked up the glass and drank deeply, the bitterness of the dissolved Ambien masked by the pulp and sweetness of the orange juice. "Thank you," he said, setting down the empty glass. "Now, can we talk about what happens next?" Denise didn't respond, just watched him with those still, patient eyes. Within 20 minutes, Harold's words began to slur together. He stumbled toward the couch, his legs suddenly refusing to cooperate with his brain. "What, Denise? What's happening?" He tried to stand but collapsed back onto the cushions, his eyelids growing impossibly heavy. "I'm making sure you can't run," Denise said quietly, standing over him. Harold's face twisted with confusion and dawning fear. You put something, 30 mg of your own sleeping pills," she confirmed, her voice as cold as winter. "Enough to keep you still, not enough to kill you." Harold's eyes widened or tried to, the drugs pulling him toward unconsciousness even as panic surged through his system. "Denise, don't. What, Harold?" She leaned closer, close enough for him,